Hi, my name is Katie, and this is Yappin' About History, a podcast where we yap about the past so that the present makes more sense. Over on my TikTok, you can follow at Yappin' About History Pod. I was talking about a seemingly unlikely connection that the Irish have to the indigenous tribes in the US, but that's not the only interesting connection that the Irish have to North America. And that's actually what we're going to be talking about this week. A group of Irish immigrant soldiers in the US Army decided to switch allegiance to Mexico during the Mexican-American War. It's a really fascinating story, and I bet you've never heard about it. Well, it's a good thing that you're here then, because it would be my honor to tell you about this group called the St. Patrick's Battalion. I first heard about the St. Patrick's Battalion while doing research for the Bear Flag Revolt episode that we did a while back, and in doing some background research on the Mexican-American War. I came across a documentary called Sail John Riley, or Life of John Riley in English, and it follows Carrie singer-songwriter Charlie O'Brien as he revisits the sites associated with Riley and tries to discover more about the Revolutionary hero's fate. You can find it on YouTube, and I'll link it in the episode description. It is in Irish, but it has English subtitles. There's also a movie called One Man's Hero, which is a play on the phrase, one man's hero is another man's traitor. It was made in 1999, and it's about John Riley and the St. Patrick's Day Battalion, or San Patricios, but it does have a 38% on Rotten Tomatoes, so, take that into consideration, I guess. I didn't get a chance to watch it, but if anyone has or does, let me know what you think. All right, so we're actually staying in the same time period that we've been talking about for the last few episodes, the 1840s in the United States of America. We've been talking about the mass Irish immigration to the US, and with that, the rise of anti-Catholic, anti-immigration groups, policies, discrimination becoming pretty rampant in the US, and this all kind of comes into play for this episode. Another concept that we've talked about on the podcast that also plays an important role in the story is the idea of manifest destiny, which is that the US, and by that it's white citizens, were divinely ordained by God to expand its territory across the entire North American continent, and it basically justified the territorial expansion and often violent displacement of indigenous Americans and Mexicans. Mexico at this point had been an independent nation for around a few decades, having won its independence from Spain earlier in 1821. The area of what is now Texas was a Mexican state under the United Mexican States and their 1824 Constitution. The officials of that state first invite U.S. immigrants to settle in what is mostly an unpopulated area to cultivate its cotton production. This is in the early 1820s, and they do this through generous land grants. There's kind of a general sort of lawlessness that prevails in this area, and Mexico's laws were not really followed or enforced, particularly when it came to the fact that these U.S. immigrants brought slavery into Mexico, with about 20% of the U.S.-born population there being enslaved people. This was illegal in Mexico, but again, they kind of turned a blind eye. And another requirement that was often overlooked for these U.S. settlers was that there was a law on the books that said they had to be Catholic or convert to Catholicism. But Mexico starts paying more attention to the U.S. settlers when they first attempt to secede from Mexico in 1826. And so they follow that up with a military occupation in that area to keep the U.S. settlers in check. We're not going to go into all the details of the whole Texas ordeal, but basically the U.S. settlers declare themselves independent of Mexico and that they're a sovereign nation, basically. Even though Mexico is kind of like, no. Mexico never recognizes the independence of Texas, but not surprisingly, it doesn't really matter because Texas is annexed by the U.S. through a U.S. congressional joint resolution and becomes a state on December 29th, 1845. And this obviously ratchets up tension with Mexico and sets the stage for the war, which occurs a year or so later. About a month before this, though, in November, the U.S. had offered to pay $5 million for New Mexico and $25 million for California. As you can imagine, the Mexico government refuses to even see the U.S. envoy that is sent over to try to negotiate this deal. By this time, diplomatic relations had already been broken off by Mexico. After the trying to buy Mexican land doesn't work, U.S. President James Polk sends troops to the contested area of Texas in January of 1846 in what seems like a tactic to try to provoke the Mexican military into armed conflict. Then on April 25th, 1846, Mexican troops fire on those U.S. troops who are on Mexican land illegally. This is exactly the fuel that Polk uses to send the order of war to Congress. Remember those days when the president used to have to ask Congress to declare wars, since they're the ones that actually have the constitutional power to do so? Yeah, anywho, Polk says, quote, Mexico has invaded our territory and has shed American blood upon American soil, end quote. Again, this is Mexican land that U.S. settlers and then the U.S. government just said that it was U.S. land because they said so. This was contentious in the general U.S. at the time, with many Northerners claiming that Polk, who was a Southerner, was provoking war in order to get more land for the slaveholding South. And then there's people like Abraham Lincoln who saw it as an invasion of Mexico. And Lincoln's actually quoted as saying, "From beginning to end, it was the sheerest deception because it was unprovoked and unjustified." And most historians agree that Polk was intentionally trying to provoke the Mexican military, who would simply be defending their homeland from invaders. It's funny how it's okay when we invade Mexico, but... Also interesting to note, Ulysses S. Grant, who served as a second lieutenant during the Mexican-American War, later on in his life called the war, quote, one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. It was an instance of a republic following the bad example of European monarchies in not considering justice in their desire to acquire additional territory, end quote. And again, it's crazy how quotes from the 1800s could be perfectly applied to today. All right, so now let's get into St. Patrick's Battalion. Joining the army was one of the very few ways to make a living for many Irish immigrants and to have some job security. As we've discussed in the past few episodes, Irish discrimination was pretty bad during this time, and help wanted signs would say no Irish need apply, things like that. But even in the US military, they faced harassment, beatings, and were called racial slurs. In the spring of 1846, US soldiers and the Texas Rangers set fire to El Fronton, a port town on the Texas Gulf along the border. This incident left an impression on many Irish immigrant soldiers who were reminded of the stories that they had heard from relatives who survived religious persecution back in Ireland. Among those Irish immigrant soldiers stationed in Texas was an Irish native, John Riley, a 28-year-old who had moved to Michigan from Galway, Ireland. There he enlisted in the army at Fort McKinnick and went on to teach West Point cadets who arrived at the fort. Riley, along with other Irish regulars, were harassed, beaten, and called racial epithets by their officers. Although war had not yet been declared, the Mexican military knew of the Irish Catholic soldiers and may have known about their mistreatment, but either way, they sensed an opportunity to appeal to the Irish U.S. soldiers through their shared Catholic faith. They started sending counter-propaganda leaflets targeting the Irish and German U.S. soldiers to plead their case. One of the main guys doing this was a Cuban-born general in the Mexican army named Pedro de Ampudia. In the letters he wrote to the U.S. soldiers, he tried to ignite their indignation about the cruelty under the flag of stars. Not only did they try to appeal to their political and religious views, they also offered land ownership, pay increases, mobility in rank, and religious freedom if they came over to the Mexican side. So then on April 12th, 1846, almost a month before war is officially declared by the U.S., Riley at first requests a pass to go and attend a Catholic service, but he kind of ends up degaffing it and he crosses the river to Matamoros anyways without permission. He ends up meeting with Ampudia, and Ampudia is impressed with Riley's intelligence and immediately commissions him as a lieutenant in the Mexican army. Riley is allowed to form an artillery unit and to entice potential deserters. And in a short amount of time, Riley is able to form a company of 48 Irishmen. They were referred to as the San Patricios or St. Patrick's, and they fought in multiple battles for Mexico, often enduring harsh conditions and rough terrain. But as they continued to fight, they could see more and more of the dehumanization of Mexican civilians at the hands of the U.S. Army, and that just kind of further radicalized them. The Mexican Army leaders picked up on this, and they tried their best to not only highlight the U.S. Army's war crimes, but also to show these Irish soldiers the anti-Catholic riots that were happening back home in the U.S. The San Patricios also created their own flag, which had a background of emerald silk, and on one side had the Mexican coat of arms with a golden harp encircled by shamrocks, and it had the motto Erin go Bragh, which is an anglicized version of the Irish phrase which means Ireland forever or Ireland until doomsday. And then on the other side of the flag, it had a figure of St. Patrick. Sadly, there are no known surviving flags or any pictures of them, just recreations based on first-hand descriptions. But as I'm sure you know, or can at least guess based on the current US border, the San Patricios' success was short-lived. In August of 1847, they moved to protect an area that was close to Mexico City because the US Army's invasion was moving in on the capital. Now with 143 Irishmen under his command, Riley and his men marched to Churubusco and they fortified themselves in a towering stone wall monastery. But after only a few hours, they run out of ammunition. 85 of the San Patricios were captured, and in late August, a very speedy trial was held for them all, in which the San Patricios had no legal representation, and there's no transcripts that were ever made of the trial, so we don't really know what was said. But most of them were convicted very hastily. Of the convicted, around 50 were sentenced to death by hanging. Between September 11th through the 13th of 1847, the 50 men were executed by hanging in groups. 16 were hanged the first day, followed by 4 more the next morning. They waited to execute the remaining 30 men so that they could be killed at the same time the US flag replaced the Mexican flag atop of the citadel. The gallows were placed so that both armies could see them because the fighting was still going on. These executions were contrary to both the Articles of War and the court-martial rules and regulations, but it didn't really matter. And it is the largest collective execution ever ordered by the US military, although the US Army ends up hanging 38 members of the Dakota tribe later on in 1862 at one time. So that's technically the largest mass execution at one time because the San Patricios were executed in groups. As Riley and some of the others deserted before the war broke out, they escaped hanging, but they were lashed and branded with the letters D on their cheeks for deserter with a cattle iron and then imprisoned. This was also not normal because the punishment was typically one of those 3 punishments, never all 3 at once. And another point to show that this punishment was not normal, everyone else who deserted would end up receiving a full pardon when the war was over, and the US Army saw a lot of deserters during this war. Of the 40,000 regulars, 5,331 would defect at some point during the war, which included nearly 1,000 Irish. It is unclear what happens to John Riley after the war is over. There is record of him leaving the US for Veracruz with $1,224, but he drops off the radar after that. Some speculate that he made his way back to Ireland, but we'll never know. The war ends on February 2nd, 1848 with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The US pays around $18 million for 2/5 of Mexico's territory, and US President Polk ends up overseeing the largest territorial expansion in US history. The treaty between the US and Mexico allowed the 100,000 Mexicans living in the now United States territories to become US citizens, and it also allowed them to keep their land and property. Despite what the treaty said, by the end of the 1800s, many Mexican Americans had been stripped of their land, faced racial discrimination, low wages, and lynchings. The US government was far removed from this new territory, both literally and figuratively, in terms of having any sort of law enforcement or military presence to make sure that these new US citizens were not messed with. Many Mexican Americans in these new US territories were living unprotected in what was now a hostile region. With a simple signing of a piece of paper, they had had their lives turned upside down and were suddenly living in a foreign country, even though they had never moved. And that is something that is not often talked about in American history. That is the racial discrimination that Mexican Americans faced, and let's be frank, still face today. Most people know or have heard of, at least, of the Jim Crow South, but Mexican Americans were treated very similarly during this time period, and the laws in the Southwest were often referred to as Juan Crow laws. I was born and raised in Southern California, and I don't remember ever learning about any of this in my history classes. An interesting example of this that I mentioned briefly briefly in the Bear Flag Revolt episode, is the Supreme Court case Mendez versus Westminster, in which a Mexican-American family sued the Westminster Public School District because they had a segregated school system that didn't allow Mexican-American students into white schools. The Supreme Court ruled that forced segregation of Mexican-American students was unconstitutional, but only because they said Mexican-Americans were considered white. So this means that the ruling couldn't be applied to African American students. But many of the arguments made in this case would end up being used in Brown versus Board of Education, which is the Supreme Court case that says that segregation of African Americans is also unconstitutional. But this wouldn't occur for another 8 years. And another interesting fun fact is that Thurgood Marshall, who ends up being the US's first African American Supreme Court justice, was the lawyer for both Mendez versus Westminster and Brown v. Board of Education. I like to bring this court case up whenever I can get the chance because I don't think it's as well known as it should be, and I think it's a really significant and important piece of our history. But back to the aftermath of the Mexican-American War. Ralph Waldo Emerson prophetically wrote, quote, "Mexico will poison us." And he was right. The U.S. had already been unsuccessfully trying to deal with the question of slavery for a while at this point, and this just threw in almost 100 million square miles more to have to sort that out in. This ends up driving the North and South even further apart and leads to violence like we see in the Bleeding Kansas confrontations, and the Civil War would break out in just 13 years from the signing of the Guadalupe Hidalgo. Emerson was right. To quote an article from battlefields.org, quote, "To say Mexico poisoned the United States is an understatement. The bloodshed during the Civil War rivaled any other American conflict, and today we are still in the process of healing wounds that occurred over 150 years ago." End quote. In Mexico City, there's a bust of John Riley and a plaque that memorializes all the Irish soldiers who were martyred at the Plaza San Jacinto. The plaque reads, quote, "In memory of the Irish soldiers of the heroic St. Patrick's Battalion, martyrs who gave their lives to the Mexican cause in the United States' unjust invasion of 1847, end quote. And every September, there's a ceremony there that commemorates the anniversary of their wrongful death. Other celebrations are held at different battle sites and at the Irish Embassy in Mexico City. And in Ireland, you can often see the San Patricios banner being waved in parades. In the documentary I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, shows that every year in Clifton, Galway, where John Riley is from, there's a celebration with a Mexican mariachi music and dancing in honor of John Riley, his men, and the Mexican effort to stop the U.S. invasion. They have been doing this since 1993. Also in Ireland, there's a mariachi band, the country's only full mariachi ensemble, that was founded in 2011. They're called the Mariachi San Patricio in honor of the Irish regiment that fought for Mexico, and it's comprised of Mexican and Irish musicians. Another pop culture reference includes a commemorative album by the Chieftains, an Irish folk band. It includes traditional Mexican folkloric music performed with a fusion of Irish and Mexican instrumentation. There's even a piece narrated by Liam Neeson called March to the Battle, and of course I linked that in the episode description for you to listen to. I also found a tequila brand called Cinco Patricios that infuses their tequila with Irish seaweed from Galway Bay, again where John Riley's from. They say on their website the name for the brand comes in part from the San Patricios, and the cinco or five comes from the five fingers, which represent the Hamza symbol or the all-powerful hand, and Los Cinco Personas, or the five people. It's highly represented in Mexican Christian art and also has European roots. It's a symbol of protection and good fortune, believed to ward off negative or evil association. Unfortunately, it looks like you can't get it in the US, but I will link their website again in the episode description for all of my European listeners. That's all I have for you this week. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Yappin' About History. I hope this episode is a reminder that what we do today will shape the stories that are told tomorrow. History isn't just something we remember, it's something we carry with us. Bye!